In 1863, King Carl XV of Sweden-Norway and King Frederick VII of Denmark came to an agreement that Sweden-Norway would support Danish goals of a united realm including Schleswig, and that when Frederick of Denmark died, the King of Sweden would inherit the Danish throne, creating a united Scandinavia including Schleswig. Meanwhile, King Frederick's heir, Christian, would in compensation become King of Holstein, making it a separate entity and member of the German Confederation. The goal of this informal agreement was avoiding a war over Schleswig and Holstein by deterring Prussia with a stronger and united Scandinavia. It was also the result of the thriving Scandinavian nationalism movement in the 1800s, which was somewhat inspired by similar movements in Germany. In the real world, all of this fell apart as the Swedish government did in principle support Danish ambitions of consolidating their realm, but were unsure of whether or not they should strive towards a union, so no formal agreement was signed before the onset of the Second Schleswig War. In this war, Sweden did not help Denmark as promised, resulting in quite a bit of resentment towards Sweden and Denmark, putting an end to this move towards Scandinavianism. But what if this didn't happen, and Scandinavia united in the mid-19th century? That's what I'll attempt to answer in this video. In this scenario, a formal agreement is quite simply reached in 1863. In the real world, the Swedish king wasn't supportive of it, and the government wasn't directly opposed to it either. They simply needed time to consider it, so this isn't really a massive change. Only a few months later, like in our world, King Frederick VII of Denmark dies, but unlike in the real world, this leaves Denmark, including Schleswig, to Carl XV, now King of Scandinavia. Holstein, as mentioned, becomes a separate kingdom ruled by the former heir to the Danish throne, Christian. Integrating Schleswig into a united Scandinavia would strictly speaking still be a breach of the London Protocol, which stated that Schleswig must have no greater constitutional affinity to Denmark than Holstein. So after the implementation of the Scandinavian Constitution a bit later in 1864, which covered Schleswig as it would now be a part of the Danish portion of the kingdom, Prussia and Austria, along with the rest of the German Confederation, would convene and have to decide what to do about this breach. But taking real-world decisions and considerations into account, I actually think this plan would have worked. It conveniently let the former Danish royal family continue to exist as monarchs in Holstein, left Holstein completely to the German Confederation and a future united Germany, and deters Prussia and Austria from taking drastic action, as it would result in a larger conflict and greater ramification for the German powers. Also, little back to reality side note here, Prussia and Austria were actually unsure if they should invade Schleswig in the real world, and the decision to do so was solely by their governments, not the German Confederation, which actually was supposed to make such decisions. Initially, Prussia and Austria contemplated settling for Holstein, as Schleswig was not a member of the German Confederation and majority Danish, and this is exactly what the rest of the German Confederation wanted. But Austria and Prussia declared war on Denmark anyway, disregarding the wishes of the rest of the German Confederation, which even contemplated declaring war on Prussia and Austria, but decided not to due to their military superiority. With it not just being Denmark they'd have to contend with, but all of Scandinavia, which very likely would have gotten more international support, Austria and Prussia would probably not have taken such drastic measures. So, going back to the scenario, Prussia and Austria do not take any immediate action. The matter is brought before the many members of the German Confederation, and they decide to let Scandinavia annex the Duchy of Schleswig while losing all sovereignty over Holstein, which is now simply an independent member of the German Confederation. Down south, relations between the German powers of Austria and Prussia would still sour eventually. Prussia would ally itself with Italy in the case of a coming conflict with Austria, which is exactly what the rising of tensions between them would eventually lead to, as Bismarck and Prussia had quite an ambitious goal, to become the true, uncontested leader of Germany. The war down south was fairly brief and resulted in a Prussian victory, with them annexing quite a bit of territory. Not long after the war, Prussia would establish the North German Confederation, a more properly consolidated entity than the former German Confederation, and a major step toward German unification as a whole, which would happen shortly after, following the Franco-Prussian War. Meanwhile, to the north, Scandinavia would grow closer and more united. Use of the Danish language in Scandinavian schools would no longer be banned, and efforts to unite the languages would be implemented. The capital and parliament would also, by the end of the 1800s, be moved to Gothenburg to promote unity, as Gothenburg happens to be almost at the Scandinavian center of population and relatively close to Denmark and Norway. The next few decades would be peaceful for Scandinavia. They would attempt to remain neutral in European affairs, with their main worry being Russia to the east, as it controlled Finland, a region Scandinavia was quite interested in reclaiming, both for historical and cultural reasons, but also for defensive reasons. They would see a bit of a downturn in the economy though, as large amounts of Swedes and Norwegians were moving to America at this time, mainly because of their limited amount of agricultural land in comparison to their population size. Outside of Europe, Scandinavia would see some expansion however. In the early years of the 20th century, during the scramble for Africa, Scandinavia would be granted a minor colony on the Gold Coast in Togo, and in East Africa between German East Africa and Portuguese Mozambique. This added to the small but growing number of Scandinavian colonies, which also included the Scandinavian, formerly Danish, West Indies, the Nicobar Islands, and of course Greenland. As briefly mentioned, the issue of Finland would have been of great importance to Scandinavia. It had since the formation of the nation been a topic of discussion in government. A direct war with Russia was out of the question, but now as the Great War raged on in the south, an opportunity for neutral Scandinavia presented itself. Finland had since the Napoleonic Wars been an autonomous region of Russia, but now during Tsar Nicola's rule, a process of Russification was implemented, stirring up nationalistic sentiment there more than ever. Already before these policies, Finnish nationalists had been promoting separatism or union with Scandinavia. As a whole, 15% of people in Finland spoke Swedish, and many Finns saw it as a preferable alternative to Russia, which sought to rid them of their language and culture. Scandinavianism as an ideology had also snuck its way into Finland, as people had heard of the success of the Union when it came to the Schleswig issue. This sentiment of the Nordic brothers being stronger together was now shared in Finland, while whether or not the Finns should consider themselves Scandinavians was a contentious topic of discussion among Finnish nationalists, with some pointing to the Kalmar Union and their shared history with Sweden, and others pointing to the more distinct nature of the Finnish language. Both had goals of achieving a greater Finland which included the Karelians to the east. Finland would get their chance at separating from Russia during the Russian Revolution. As the provisional government was put in place in Russia, the Finnish parliament was given most of the power in Finland. The provisional government in Russia quickly disbanded the parliament and called for new Finnish elections, likely in the hopes of a socialist victory. Tensions in Finland would rise, and both the socialist Red Guards and anti-socialist White Guards would mobilize their forces. The anti-socialists ended up winning a majority in the Finnish Senate, but Finland remained at peace for the time being. When the October Revolution happened in Russia, and the Finnish Senate opted for independence rather than uniting with the Bolsheviks, Lenin, who agreed to self-determination before taking power, let Finland have independence, and in December of 1917, Finland was fully independent. This would, however, be enough to trigger the January 1918 socialist uprising in Finland. Here, the socialist Red Guards, with the help of Russian troops stationed in Finland, would quickly take over the developed south of the country. The White Guards, supported by Scandinavian volunteers, were soon joined by the Finnish Jaegers, a force of Swedish-speaking Finns that fought for Germany in World War I. They would make some initial gains, but the Civil War would really take a turn when Scandinavia sent thousands of troops to Finland in the hopes of gaining favor among the Finns and avoiding another Russian takeover of Finland. Germany would do the same once they had signed a peace treaty with Russia. The joint Scandinavian Finnish and German forces would soon after occupy Helsinki, and by May 1918 the Reds had all but crumbled. When the socialist forces had been mostly dealt with, the Finnish parliament considered various options for their new monarch, among them Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany's brother-in-law, Frederick Charles, and Gustav V of Scandinavia, who along with the Scandinavian government had quite an enticing proposal. But as Germany was currently at war with the British, who had forces stationed in East Karelia, a region Finland was keen on claiming, and due to the rise in Scandinavianism as an ideology, after Scandinavia had helped end the Finnish Civil War, they opted for Gustav V in order to make Finland a part of the Scandinavian Union. This agreement was reached mainly due to the Scandinavian proposal in which they would support the Finnish cause for unification with their Karelian brothers to the east if they picked Gustav V of Scandinavia as their monarch. This also allowed Finland to distance itself from Germany, which was important if they wanted the British to recognize Finnish claims to East Karelia. Their plans were a success, as the British forces would not oppose the incoming Finns and Scandinavians, who managed to take control of the Murmansk Railroad. Karelia would now be occupied by Finnish and Scandinavian forces for some time, until a peace deal could be made with whichever side would win the Russian Civil War. Following their successful invasion of Karelia, Scandinavia and Finland would also assist Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in their wars of independence, but would otherwise stay out of the Russian Civil War. Eventually, by 1920, when the Bolsheviks had defeated most of the White Army, the Treaty of Tartu was signed between Scandinavia and the Bolsheviks. Here the borders would be finalized, and the Bolsheviks would recognize Finnish and Scandinavian sovereignty over most of East Karelia and the Kola Peninsula. With peace finally achieved, the status of Finland as a part of Scandinavia was the main focus of the Finnish and Scandinavian parliaments. It was decided that Finland would keep its parliament and retain much autonomy and local rule, much more than the other constituent countries. But Finland would officially be a part of the now renamed United Kingdoms of Scandinavia and Finland, de jure still one country with open borders, a currency union, united military, and Finnish representatives in the parliament in Gothenburg. A more controversial issue facing the nation was the Russian minority now present in Finland. The Finnish anti-socialist coalition, fueled by anti-Russian sentiment and fear of another uprising or civil war, decided on an expulsion of Russians in Karelia and Murmansk as a part of a population exchange with Bolshevik Russia, where Karelians and other Finnic peoples, such as Ingrians and Vespians on the Russian side of the border, would also be sent to Finland. This decision would be scrutinized in the Scandinavian parliament and face international condemnation, becoming one of the biggest stains in Finnish and Scandinavian history. One side effect of this population exchange would be a significant depopulating of East Karelia and especially the Kola Peninsula, as the amount of Russians displaced severely outnumbered the small number of arriving Finnic peoples. Following the population exchange and reorganizing of Finland as a part of the United Kingdoms of Scandinavia and Finland, the nation as a whole would develop and prosper. The 1920s saw great economic growth and expansion of infrastructure. This would come to an end during the economic recession in the 1930s though, and things would really take a turn for the worst in 1939. Here the Soviets, not long after having signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, demanded some minor territorial concessions from Scandinavia, including the port of Hanko, quite far west into Finland. The Scandinavian and Finnish parliaments would refuse these demands, and this led to the Soviets invading, starting the Winter War. To the surprise of the Soviets, the Scandinavians and Finns would turn out to be formidable fighters, their generals cleverly using the terrain and being on the defensive to their advantage. The Soviets had greatly underestimated them. Soviet casualties would end up in the millions, while Scandinavian and Finnish casualties would only be in the tens of thousands. Scandinavia, knowing that they couldn't hold back the hordes of Soviet troops forever, and the Soviets, not wanting to lose millions more to only make minor gains, both agreed to sign a peace deal. Here the Soviets would be granted a lease on the Hanko port and a border by Leningrad slightly further north than they initially demanded. Scandinavia would however not remain peaceful for long. To the south, the Second World War was in full swing, and Germany needed resources for their war machine. One such resource was iron, which Scandinavia had an abundance of in northern Sweden. This iron was being transported south to Germany through the port of Narvik, as Scandinavia was neutral and didn't want to provoke the Germans into invading. This only resulted in the British blocking off the port of Narvik with mines though, and this was a problem for Germany. As such, Germany demanded that Scandinavia would allow German troops to enter and their fleet to sail in their waters, officially to protect them from the British, but in reality mainly to secure their iron and potentially invade the Soviets on another front later on. Scandinavia refused these demands, and Germany invaded from the south shortly after. They would swiftly roll through Denmark and get footholds in several port cities, and Scandinavia surrendered within a day in order to avoid any more fighting, knowing that they would be unable to stop the Germans. Scandinavia would make minor concessions to Germany, allowing them to gain sovereignty over Schleswig, Bornholm, and Gotland. German troops would also be allowed into Scandinavian territory to secure Swedish iron and the port of Narvik, unwillingly making Scandinavia a member of the Axis. Germany would continue its war with Scandinavia playing a minor role. As they declared war on the Soviet Union, Scandinavia would participate on the Northern Front, actually making some considerable gains. But down south, the tides eventually turned, and as soon as it became clear to officials in Scandinavia and Finland that Germany would lose the war, they surrendered. This resulted in them having to concede more minor territories to the Soviet Union. The Allies and USSR also demanded that German troops be removed from Scandinavia, which did lead to a minor war across Scandinavia, where Scandinavian troops, with the aid of the Allies and Soviets, fought the German troops stationed in the kingdom. This was fairly successful, although the German troops continued to occupy Jutland till the end of the war a year later, when Germany finally surrendered. After the war, there was sympathy for Scandinavia and the West, as they certainly were a victim of circumstance, having been stuck between two great powers. The Allies were also keen on keeping a strong united Scandinavia as an ally right by the Soviet Union, and as such, Scandinavia got German-occupied Jutland, including the conceded southern portion, back immediately, facing no repercussions other than their lost territories to the USSR. Germany would then be occupied by the Allied powers, and Europe would be split between East and West. You probably already know the story from then on, so I won't bother telling it in detail. The Cold War goes on much like in the real world, with Scandinavia joining NATO. Scandinavia grants most of its colonies independence, but keeps Greenland and the Scandinavian West Indies, a series of minor islands in the Caribbean, the real world's US Virgin Islands. Scandinavia will throughout the latter half of the 1900s have an immigration policy more similar to that of real-world Denmark and Norway than Sweden, since politically they make up a bigger bloc. This results in slightly fewer immigrants arriving in Sweden in modern history, but similar amounts in the rest of the Nordics. What really sets the Nordic region in this world apart from the real world is how much more interconnected it is. More infrastructure connecting the constituent countries will be built. Much of the kingdom speaks a dialect of the same language, Scandinavian, and the United Kingdom of Scandinavia and Finland is among the more relevant powers in Europe. But if you want to learn more about that and the United Kingdoms of Scandinavia and Finland today in 2021, stay tuned for part 2. Consider becoming a member if you want to support the channel. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more content like this in the future. See you next time.